All right, welcome class. So this morning, this Monday, we will be learning about object-oriented programming in JavaScript. You know, we spent all last week learning the basics of OOP in Python, and a lot of those concepts are going to carry over. We're still going to be talking about classes and instances, instant methods, and things like that. We're just going to be learning kind of a new syntax for these familiar concepts. However, JavaScript, being JavaScript is always a little bit weird. So the syntax for this is going to look fairly different from what we've seen in Python, what you'll see in other programming languages. But the concepts are the same. I'm telling you, it's still object-oriented programming. And also, most importantly, people are probably going to be asking you questions about this stuff in the near future. There's not a whole lot of complexity really in JavaScript. It doesn't get too deep, it doesn't really have a million features compared to like Python or C#, but there are certain topics that are a little bit tricky and show up pretty reliably in interviews. The quirks of OOP and JavaScript are definitely one of them. I've been made to answer these questions like dozens of times, especially in junior developer interviews. I'm expecting you all will as well. So if your job has anything to do with JavaScript, if there's any front end component to your job, these are questions that you are likely to be asked about. So even though this is something that you're not going to necessarily do every day in your job, these are things that I think that you're kind of responsible for knowing as a junior developer. So let's get into the actual meat here, talk about something specific. So the first kind of weird thing that we need to get comfortable with is that in JavaScript, we don't actually have proper OOP classes. So there isn't actually such a thing as a class in JavaScript. Instead, in JavaScript, we have something called a prototype, which can be used to define shared behavior of a group of objects, similarly to classes. So prototypes in JavaScript have some unique benefits when you compare them to classes in other languages, but we will not be exploring the ways that prototypes are better than or different from classes. Instead, we will learn how to recreate object-oriented programming in JavaScript using the tools that are available to us. So I think this is kind of weird and bears repeating, just that nobody really appreciates prototypes for what they are. So like they are kind of neat and powerful and flexible in the ways that you can, define related sets of objects or whatever, and just nobody cares. Nobody actually uses prototypes in JavaScript like the way they were originally intended to be used. The only thing that anyone ever does with prototypes in JavaScript is to just kind of like wrangle them into a weird shape so that it looks like an object-oriented class. So I'm just going to show you kind of idiomatic JavaScript syntax for how we use prototypes to make them behave like an OOP class. So we want to recreate OOP the way it exists in Python or in any other conventional object-oriented language. Okay, but so before we can actually talk about OOP or prototypes in JavaScript, there is a new keyword that I need to introduce in JavaScript. So in JavaScript, OOP relies on the this keyword in JavaScript, which is very similar to self in Python. However, this also has a few uses outside of the context of OOP. So first, I'm going to show you just what the this keyword does in the most generic sense. And then we're going to see how it's used with prototypes to recreate object-oriented programming in JavaScript. Let's create some HTML here. Body. A little console log here, make sure this is actually loaded. All right, so I'm gonna start a little Python server real quick to run this HTML file. Python, gonna invoke the HTTP module using -m. Module is called HTTP. It's got a method inside of it called server. Just gonna run that, and it tells me that there is a server running on port 8000 on my local machine. So I can access that with localhost 8000. And just in case anyone's curious, I can put that in the notes in case anyone wants to run their own little server. Yeah, okay. Great. So that's how this little local web server is working. So it's at localhost 8000. Okay, I got my H1, so that's great. I'm going to open up my console. Cool. So now I've got main.js is loaded in. I see the hello world logging. So it looks like I'm ready to go. So now we've got to learn about how this keyword works. Dennis, do you have a question before we dive in?
Can you go back to the HTML real quick, please?
Yep. Not a whole lot going on here. Good?
Yeah, good. Thank you.
Do we have any other questions? Cool. So I'll actually put this in a comment up here because we're going to be looking at this file for a while now. So if you let's just take a look. Console.log this. So you see it lights up in my editor. VS Code knows that this is a special keyword. So when I just console log this, it gives me the window object. So that's the global object in the browser that every other object, every local variable belongs to. So you can see like alert is defined here, confirm, document. You know, everything that you think of as being globally defined is actually a property on the window object in JavaScript. So when you reference this at the top of like when you call this in the global scope, I'm not inside of a function here. This refers to the window. Okay, that's not super interesting. If you ever try to console log this and it gives you the window object, that probably means you just made a mistake. You never actually want to access the window object through this. This is just the default behavior when you're not inside of a function. So what's much more interesting is when we reference this from inside of a function. So let's first create an object, another Alice object. She's going to have a method, say hello. This is a function. Okay. So I've defined a method on this object. I'm going to call it, and we'll see what it shows us. So here, when I access this.name, it's giving me Alice. The reason for that is because when you access this inside of a function, this refers to the object that function is attached to. So this is the simplest way that I can phrase this. I'm going to show you some more complicated examples in the near future, but this is really the heart of it. If you see the this keyword and you want to know what the value of this is, you have to just look at the object that contains that function. So here, say hello is a function, and it is attached to this object Alice. So when I access this.name, it's going to give me this name property, Alice. Let's just copy this over to the notes because it's important. Also, just one of my usual disclaimers, this lecture is not necessarily very long, but definitely pretty weird. So please ask questions if something seems a little unusual to you. JavaScript is definitely kind of an unconventional language. I expect this is going to look weird to most of us the first time we see it. So please ask questions if something doesn't make sense to you.
I got a question.
Yep.
So we've got a function within an object, and so this refers to that object. If we have a function outside an object, like a regular function, and would this again refer to the window object?
Yeah, because again, like I was saying before, the window is the global object in front-end JavaScript. It's the object that contains all other like global variables. So in this case, this function, what is this? It looks like it's not attached to any object, but with our knowledge of JavaScript quirks, we know that it is actually attached to the window object. So this is going to give me the window. Good question. Let's see what we're thinking. Okay, so next example, we're going to get a little bit trickier. So I remember on one of our first days here, I showed you how there are a few different ways that you can define functions in JavaScript. Hang on a second. There's a few different ways you can define functions in JavaScript. So what we saw already was the traditional function declaration using the function keyword. But there's also arrow functions. Does anyone know the difference between arrow functions and regular functions?
I think in arrow functions, you're looking at like every time you call on an item, it's like a copy of it. Like you can't really rewrite to the item. I forgot probably better terminology than that.
They're not pulled, I guess, to the top. Like you have to do them. You can't call them until you've actually defined them.
That's
as opposed
true.
to the regular.
So an arrow function is just like a JavaScript anonymous function that is part of ES6.
So they can be anonymous often. In this case, it's the value for this property. So I don't really think of this as being an anonymous function because I had this name to refer to it with, bob.hello. Although you could still think of it as being an anonymous function in a certain sense. But that's not what I'm getting at here. There is a functional difference between these two that hasn't been relevant until now. So I'll forgive you if nobody knows it.
I think it doesn't rebind the value of the function itself or something.
It doesn't rebind the value of this.
Oh,
So when I'm showing you here how inside of a function, this takes the value of the object that function is attached to, that only applies when you use the function keyword like this. So when I'm just using an arrow function, it does less, essentially. It does nothing. It has not rebound the value of this. It's just what it would be naturally. So does anybody want to take a guess then? When I call bob.sayHello, what are we going to see in our console? Just based on what we've learned so far this morning.
Is it the window properties?
Yeah. So bob.sayHello is going to show us the window. Or it's going to print out window.name, which is not very interesting. So yeah, window.name is an empty string. It's not even undefined. It's predefined as an empty string. I'm not really sure why the window has a name property, but it's always there, empty string. And so that's what got interpolated in here. Because like I was saying, this arrow function doesn't change the value of this. So in order to understand what this is, I have to look outside of this arrow function to find a traditional function, but there isn't one in this case. So this is going to refer to the window. Cool. Right, so let's see another example. I'm going to get even trickier here. All right, so who wants to take a guess at what we see when Carol says hello?
The function's name.
Yeah.
Well, so what is this on line 34?
Carol object,
Why do we think that?
because you said that this, when it's wrapped inside of a function, takes the identity of the object that it's encapsulated in.
Wouldn't it be the say hello function?
So it's not this doesn't take the value of the function it's encapsulated in. That's not how I would phrase things. This takes the value of the function that it is a property of. So, these are properties on a function, are key value pairs. So what object is this function a property of?
Carol,
Is
Say
it?
hello.
I think it refers back to the window.
Yeah, it's the window. So I'm just defining an anonymous function right here in set timeout. It's not attached to any object. I know this is tricky because I have defined this function inside of a function which is attached to an object, but like you're overthinking it. All you need to know what this refers to is you look at the function it appears in, and then look at the object that that function is a property of. So here, this occurs inside of this function. It is not a property of any object. So when Carol says hello, we're going to see the window object. And again, my name is empty string, because window.name is an empty string. So we're going to do this a little bit differently now. Make a Dan object. Now, instead of a regular function here, I'm going to use an arrow function. So now let's try this again. When Dan says hello, what are we going to see in our console?
My name is Dan.
Okay, and why are we going to see that? What is the value of this? How do we know that?
Because you said an arrow function doesn't know what to do with this, so it goes up to the next one.
That's right. So I'm looking at this, and I need to see the traditional function that it's defined inside of. So most immediately, it's defined inside of an arrow function, but I don't care about that because arrow functions have no bearing on the value of this. So I'm going to go up one level until I can find a traditional function that it is defined inside of. So I do find one in this case, the value of say hello. And so this is the value of an object property, say hello. It's attached to this Dan object, which does have a name property. So this .name is going to tell me Dan. Cool. My name is Dan. Do we have any questions about that last bit before things get a little bit weirder? I think someone's muted. No, no questions? Okay. what do we predict we're going to see just calling say hello like this?
The window.
Say hello.
Um, So yeah, my name is empty string because this function is not attached to any specific object. It's just attached to the window object. So this is the window and name is empty string. Great. Now let's get a little bit more interesting. Our Eve object. Okay, so now what do we think we're going to see for each of these two function calls? Oh, wait, hang on. I know how to write JavaScript. Okay, so now that this is actually a valid JavaScript syntax, what are we expecting to see when we run these two lines of code?
Window for the first one, and then say hello for the second one.
It's kind of odd, isn't it?
Or my name is whatever. Yeah.
Cool. So first we just call the say hello function by itself. Tells me that, my name is empty string, great. Then I call the say hello function as a property of the Eve object. And here it behaves differently. Tells me my name is Eve because it's accessing the object itself when we reference this. But then, strange enough, when I try to compare those functions, say hello versus eve.sayHello, just like you should expect, they are the exact same function. You're not like two functions that do the same thing. This is the exact same function, the same piece of memory on my machine. It's just two different variables that refer to the same thing. But yet still, when I call them each, they do different things. So this is maybe one of the strangest parts about OOP in JavaScript, that the value of this depends on how the function is called, not how it's defined.
Would that also work with square brackets?
Would what work with square brackets?
Or like block notation? Or am I saying it right? For Eve.
Dot notation. If you want to just be
Yeah.
like, I don't know. Sure, why not? Or wait.
Yeah.
In JavaScript, dot notation and bracket notation are pretty much interchangeable. There are some situations where you cannot use dot notation, and so you must use bracket notation. But in situations like this, I could have done it either way. My preference would be to use dot notation because it's a little bit less typing. I think it's easier to read and it communicates better my intentions here.
Okay.
Mhm.
Hey, Raphael, if you
Yep.
don't mind, could you spend a couple minutes reiterating how you are running this from the web server thing? Like how you set that up?
Yeah, so at the command line, I am running a web server. So you can see here, it's like still ongoing. I don't, like my terminal is busy. If I hit Control C, it's going to crash out of that. See now that my website is down, so I can't be reached, refuse to connect, yada, yada. The command I used is python-m http.server. And then with all the default values, that creates a web server out of the folder that you're currently CD'd into on port 8000. And I can access that on my local machine at localhost 8000. Sound good?
Yeah, nice. Okay, thanks.
Mhm.
Mine shows the directory listing for whatever I have in here. Did you just click on?
If you don't have an index HTML, it'll just show
Uh-huh.
you all the files inside of it.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, index HTML is a very conventional, like default or first page name. So lots of web servers are configured to look for that name specifically. Okay,
So when we type the Python dash m http.server, it should open that window, or
it won't open the window. You're going to have to go to your browser, open a new tab, type in localhost 8000. It'll be ready for you and running when you go there, but you have to actually manually open your browser and navigate to the page.
okay.
Okay. So that's as much as I want to show you about this, at least outside of an OOP context. But there's one other thing I want to tell you about. So, in 2022, I don't think it's maybe the most useful thing for me to be teaching you this to make you like actually do this with your hands, because this is a little bit more old fashioned, but I just want you to be aware that this concept exists in JavaScript. There are 3 built-in functions in JavaScript. Called call, apply, and bind. That what these do is these functions let you either call a specific function or redefine a specific function using a forced value for this. So normally, there are these rules that you have to follow that I've been teaching you this morning about how you can figure out what this refers to based on, functions attached to objects. And if it's a regular function or an arrow function, you can kind of determine what this refers to. But it's also possible to use these built-in functions, call, apply, and bind. So these are actually properties of any other function. So even like, these are just built-in methods of other functions that let you kind of reuse the functions in different ways. I don't think it's so important right now that we actually get into the mechanics of how they work. But the point is that this is possible in JavaScript that the value of this can be forced to be anything. And this becomes relevant because later on when we're working with frameworks, you're going to be defining your own functions that you don't call. You're going to write your functions using the this keyword, but then the framework is going to call them for you. And when the framework calls your functions, it might call them using call, apply, or bind. So basically what I'm trying to tell you is that it is impossible for you to know what the value of this might refer to if you're not calling the function yourself. The framework can rebind your function to have this refer to like whatever that framework thinks is useful. So if you want to know, like when you're writing a React application, for example, and you want to know what this is going to refer to, you're not going to be able to use the same thought process that I showed you this morning. You have to just read the documentation, because under the hood, React could be rebinding this to be like anything, because you don't see how your functions get called. React is going to be fiddling with this value and then call your functions for you. You just have to read the documentation to know what this refers to and how to make use of it. Okay. So I just wanted to give you that kind of disclaimer about JavaScript is the Wild West, and this could be anything, even though I just taught you all the rules about how it conventionally should work. So yeah, in like previous years, when I taught this class, there would be a little section right now about how to actually use call, apply, and bind. But I think that's a little bit deep in the weeds for where we're at today. So the next thing I want to talk about is the new keyword, which is actually a very old keyword in JavaScript. It was in the original version of the language, but this is the name of the keyword is new. OOP in JavaScript is very hard to talk about in general because it uses very like common generic words like this and new, but I'm doing my best. So anyways, I think we're about due for a break right now. When we come back, we're going to talk about the new keyword in JavaScript and how it interacts with this. But before we take a break, do we have any last minute questions people have on their minds right now? No questions about OOP and JavaScript? All right, so it's 10:12 right now. Let's come back at 10:25, and we're going to learn about this. See you soon. All right. So now that we kind of understand how the this keyword works, we're going to move on, and there's another keyword that I'm going to have to show you called new. So in JavaScript, we don't have a class keyword that we use for creating classes. Instead, we're just going to use normal functions. However, if we want to use a function as a constructor for an OOP class, we call it differently by adding the new keyword. This slightly changes how the function executes. So I'm going to show you what a conventional class looks like in JavaScript. And then we're going to use the new keyword for actually instantiating an object. Make a class for a person. All right, so this. It's wrong here. Oh, I already have a person else. So we've got Mallory is our new person we created. Let's see what she looks like. All right, so this is a simple class in JavaScript. This should look kind of familiar based on the Python versions. Instead of assigning to self, we're assigning to this. There's some other differences though that we'll have to cover in just a second. But let's see what we've got so far. So when I console log the class itself, it just tells me the function's definition, which is great, fine, it's a function. I console log it, tells me, definition of it. When I console log the person that I instantiated, tells me I've got this Mallory object, it's got name Mallory. So that's kind of what I would expect based on assigning to this .name. And we also see down here that Mallory has a prototype. So because I called this function with the new keyword, that causes the function to behave a little bit differently to create the behavior that we just saw. So normally with what you know about functions already, this function shouldn't do anything particularly interesting. You might expect it to take in a string argument and then assign it to window.name, because this person function isn't attached to any object. So this .name you might think refers to the window. However, when we call the function with this or with new, it changes the way the function executes in a few ways. So first of all, so when you call a function with new, this line of code just happens implicitly automatically. It's as if the first thing that your function does is create an empty object called this. So you never actually see this written out. You don't have to write this yourself, but you need to understand that this is what's happening. I'm sorry, when you call a function with new, it does this, const this equals empty object. And then also at the end of the function, another thing happens automatically, is that this object gets returned. So you might have thought that was weird that I didn't have a return statement in here, but yet somehow the value of this got assigned to Mallory. And that's because that's just another automatic thing that happens when I use the new keyword. So calling this function without new is totally useless. It's probably a mistake, based on how I define this. It looks like it's supposed to be a constructor function. So calling this without new would be a mistake. I need the new keyword to make this function as an object-oriented constructor function. But yeah, so when I do call it with new, we first create this empty object, and then I can assign properties to it. So here we just have the name, but there might be other properties as well that I want to assign. And then it gets returned automatically, so we can assign it to variables. So it works pretty similarly to how constructor functions work in Python. So you can imagine all of this inside of here as being like your init method. It gets parameter arguments passed in from the function call. We can assign it to this, or it would be self in Python. And then this, or self in Python, gets returned at the end of the call. So a lot of similarities here. All right, please ask questions. Who is confused about what's going on here?
So as soon as you use this, does it automatically make a person an object? I mean, functions are always an object, so I guess
Yeah,
I just answered my own question. Never mind.
cool. Are there other questions? Skylar?
Like a weird one. Okay, so potentially, in this context of using new, could you even throw a print in between, I guess, like your comment where the return would be? So after the name, could you do like how you did before this, my name is this inside of here, and it still also do that? I would think it would, right? Like do the console log.
Or did you want to see something specific, or see
Oh,
the
just
value of
yeah,
this?
just whatever. Just to, I guess, to prove that it does or does not execute that as well, instead of just putting out the name. Okay.
So yeah, it says hello, and then this, let's get those out of there. So yeah, this is the person object that we are about to create. Cool. Any other questions? All right, so let's continue.
Kaylee had a question in chat.
Yeah, I was just curious why we were saying we are pretending this is a class. I didn't know if I was missing something.
Because I've not used any class keyword. I'm just using a function here.
Okay, I see.
Like JavaScript just doesn't really have a feature built in called classes. It's just that every other programming language does, and we really wish that JavaScript did. So we're going to use the tools that JavaScript does provide us to make something that behaves like classes in other programming languages.
So my question is about the what you're doing in the console. How are you, I was able to pull it up through live server, but like, how are you running the stuff in the console on the local host?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so for one thing, I'm CD'd into the directory where my index.html file is here. So if I ls, I can see it's right in front of me. And it's using that default name, index.html. And then in order to run the server at this location, of Python, I'm going to use a Python module. So we use -m. Of the module is http.server. I just hit enter. And so now that runs, it occupies my terminal. It's busy here. I can't do anything else. Nothing happens because it's thinking, it's working. There's a web server now on port 8000 on my machine. So I go to localhost :8000, and it shows me this website that I'm running locally.
Yeah, so I tried to do that. It says that it can't access localhost. And like when I type it in, mine does not do that same response where it starts running. It pretty much just allows me to keep typing more stuff in, and I'm in the folder.
Says you can't access localhost.
Yeah, when I do it on the website.
That's really unusual. I might have to debug this offline.
Okay. But actually, so my initial question, because I bypassed that and opened it with live server, is everything that you're doing when you're showing us how it's reflected in the console, how are you doing that? Like when you're actually in the on the HTML, like when you're showing us the website and how it's reflected and stuff. Yeah, down there. How are you doing that or running that? Like, what are you doing down there?
I mean, just have the console open, so any console logs will show up right there. It's you go to inspect, that brings up the whole developer tools down here, and then the second tab is going to be console.
Okay.
So yeah, anytime you're doing any kind of front-end JavaScript work, you should probably keep your console tab open all the time, just so you can see errors as they pop up. Yeah, I know that hasn't been relevant quite yet because we've been mostly working with Node for our JavaScript challenges. Danielle, you have a question?
Yeah, can you do inheritance in this case, like modifying another constructor?
You can do inheritance with prototypes in JavaScript. That is a bit deep in the weeds, so I'm not going to cover that in today's lecture. It definitely is possible, and it looks even weirder than the things that we've seen so far. Yeah, I just don't think it's useful for me to be teaching that to you. Don't think it's what you need to be focused on.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. What other questions, Caleb?
Yeah, so is it kind of practice to run things inside your terminal? I mean, inside the web page versus like running things through Node to see if they work?
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
Is it when you're working on projects and stuff, are we often going to be running it through like a local host server to see our errors and stuff, or do you use Node more often than that?
I mean, when we're actually like building applications, you're going to do everything through a server on localhost.
Okay.
Yep.
Is it typical you just Control-C to end that process?
Yep.
Okay.
I actually don't know if there's another way to get out of here. Well, I mean, I guess I could open up another terminal tab and then like try to find the process. But that's definitely the harder way. You can just Control-C from the tab where it's running, that'll crash out. What other questions do we have? No questions? Okay, let's move on. So this here, this basically reproduces the init method in Python. All we're doing is adding properties to an object. So if we want to have methods, there's a couple ways you can add methods in JavaScript. So this is actually not the correct way, although it might seem like it. Okay, so technically this does work. I can just assign a function to this, and then Mallory will have that ability. Cool, my name is Mallory. So this does technically work. People say that you're not supposed to do it this way because it's a little bit inefficient. The problem is that if I had like 1,000 person objects, then I've created 1,000 copies of this function. And that's not necessary because every one of my person objects can use the exact same copy of the function, as long as it has this in the function so that each object can refer to itself when they call that same function. So not going to do it like that. Instead, what we do is we will attach methods to the person prototype. So every function in JavaScript has a prototype property that lets you define shared behavior that objects constructed from that function can share. All right, so now, instead of putting the say hello method directly on this in the constructor, I'm defining this function only once and attaching it to the person prototype. So now when I call Mallory.sayHello, JavaScript will first check if Mallory herself has this capability to say hello. And if she doesn't have the method, JavaScript will search for it on Mallory's constructor's prototype. Now, that object can also have its own constructor with a different prototype, which might have its own constructor with yet another prototype. And so we can set up like prototype chains like that, where if you try to call a method on an object, there might be a list of like, 6 or 7 locations that JavaScript checks to see where this method is defined, to see which version it's going to use. So in that way, you can set up inheritance in JavaScript using prototypes. But again, that's a little bit deep in the weeds, so we're not going to get into inheritance in JavaScript today, but just know that it's possible using prototypes. But yeah, so this is the conventional way that you define methods in a JavaScript OOP class by attaching those methods to the prototype. So now if I reload the page here, you can see it still works exactly the same way. We get that console log of my name is Mallory. Printing out when we do Mallory.sayHello, even though sayHello is not a method that we attach inside of the constructor, we attach it afterwards as part of the prototype. But in JavaScript, that's just how we make methods accessible to the class. Skylar?
Yeah, so the way I'm like picking it up then is like essentially the person on line 69, everything in there would essentially, I would want to put just information about that particular JS class. And then outside of that, then I would do all my methods that I want to create for that class.
Right. This person function here is basically just the init method in a Python OOP class, because that's where you're taking the arguments from when the constructor is called and then attaching them to the newly created object. So then, yeah, all the method definitions, that happens outside of this person function. And so honestly, that's one thing that I think a lot of people don't really like about JavaScript OOP, is that it just seems kind of disorganized, that like we have 2 different blocks of code, one for the instance properties, and then more blocks of code for adding methods to the prototype. Whereas like in Python, all of our OOP code can sit inside of a class and it's in one like indented code block. So it's all together. And that just kind of feels more organized to me. That's how OOP would work in any other language too, where your entire class is together like in one set of curly braces or in one indented block. It's kind of weird how it is in JavaScript, where I have this like separate block of code to attach a method to the prototype. But that's just kind of how JavaScript works. Questions?
Yes, I have a question. Going along with line 69, so if we wanted to add an attribute such as age, could we just pass that as an argument and use this dot age equals age?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. What other questions do we have?
For you can go back to the right there. So person.prototype.sayHello, it's taking the object.prototype, right? And you're just adding another method to it that's just used when you use the person object, right? Or the person function, my bad. How does that work exactly again?
How does this person.prototype.sayHello work?
For the prototype, is it just taking the the function or like whatever object prototype and then just adding one more thing to it, but it keeps all the other attributes of it and but it doesn't change the original prototype.
I'm not sure if I understand your question.
For how I thought prototypes worked was that it's like all the attributes for like objects or arrays or anything or like different types are stored in the prototype of it, right? Or something like that. All the methods for them or something.
The methods are stored there.
Yes. And this is just like adding another method just to that one function or object or whatever.
Yeah, just to this one object, just to the person prototype, so that all of our person objects will have access to these methods. So since you mentioned it, I'm taking a look at the array prototype. So I might have mentioned before that in JavaScript, everything is really an object. Even arrays are objects. So even though there is, this literal syntax for creating arrays, my array equals square brackets, whatever, you can also take kind of the OOP approach to it and say like my list equals new array. And my list is an array. So this is like what's actually happening under the hood when you write your code like this. JavaScript is using the arrays constructor function with the new keyword to instantiate a new object. And then that object can access any method on the array prototype. So if I look at array.prototype, we can see here, it's got all those array methods that you're used to using, concat, filter, find, flat, join, index of, map, pop, push, reduce. It's all right here on the prototype. Any method that all arrays have, this is where you will find it. Does that answer your question?
I think it does.
Would you like
I was
to
just
ask
kind of
a follow-up
confused how it
question?
was all going together.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Oh, I said that kind of answered a little bit because I was just confused how it was going together with the prototype and stuff.
Mm-hmm. Cool.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but I think, because I would be worried like, well, what's all in the prototype or whatever, but you can just print person and it'll show you all the methods included in it, right? Or console.log person, I mean.
It's got say hello and it's got a constructor function.
Okay, thought so.
Let's add another method real quick just for funsies. That's how we would just add another method. It's just properties on an object. But as long as this property is on the person prototype, all of my person objects have access to it. So yeah, name is Mallory and then see you later. Probably don't need so much punctuation there. Saw a few other hands up. There were like 4 hands up 2 seconds ago. Who's got questions?
Forgot what my question was.
We had some questions in the chat that I think were pretty good.
Would anyone writing questions in the chat like to ask
I
them?
have a question actually.
Yep.
So I guess I'm still not understanding what the purpose of like the prototype is. Like, it seems like when on line 85, you're creating an instance of a new person named Mallory. Why do you need like the method in there? Because I'm just going over like some of the objects we made in the beginning of the lecture, where we created a object called Bob, and then we gave him the name Bob, and then we gave him a method also just to say hello. So I'm just kind of confused, like why you couldn't just put the function say hello. Is it because like if you have multiple people?
Do you mean like why don't I just put the function say hello right here?
Yeah.
So this does work. Like we saw a second ago, like I can run this code and this method will be accessible on all my person objects. This is just thought as being not the best way to make methods available to your objects. The issue is that if I create 1,000 person objects, that I'm duplicating this function. I've created a copy of this function for every object that I've instantiated, and that's just a little bit wasteful.
Okay.
So by
Gotcha.
defining it on the prototype, I define this method once, and then all of my person objects can share that one copy of that one function.
Okay. And when you're using the prototype, do you need to use the keyword new?
It's when I instantiate an object using like JavaScript OOP. So if I have a function that is intended to be a constructor function, it must be called using the new keyword.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody else asking questions in chat? Want to ask questions out loud?
I have a question. I'm not sure if now's a good time to ask it or if you're going to touch on it later. I was going to ask about how exporting would work with this. Or maybe now is not a good time to.
Well, so right now I'm just using a simple JavaScript file in the browser, so there just is no exporting. Everything you define in JavaScript is, globally defined. I could add another script here if I want, but any variables I define in this, any variables I define in this first script, if they're global, will also be accessible in this second script, because there's only one window object. It's the window. So global variables defined in any script are accessible in all the other ones. So there's really no sense of import or export the way that we're working currently.
Okay.
When we get to React, we're going to find some other tools that let us import and export. But that's because, thinking how to put this, we're going to be using tools that transform our code into actual valid JavaScript. So when we're working with React, we're actually going to be writing code that browsers don't necessarily understand. But then we're going to use other tools to automatically transform it into something that browsers do understand. So we are going to be writing import export statements when we work with React, but for what I'm doing today, it's not going to work.
Okay.
What other questions do we have? No more questions? Okay. So I think it's about time to take a break. Yeah, so about time to take a break. When we come back, I'm going to tell you about some new syntax in JavaScript that gives us a slightly more convenient way to set up our prototypes. But before we do that, I think we're due for a break. And of course, one last chance for questions before we go on a break. Anybody have anything they're curious about? Don't want to lose your thought on the break for the next 10, 15 minutes. No, nobody, nothing. Okay, so it's 10:56, a little after. Let's take a 13, 14-minute break. Come back at 11:10, and we're going to learn about some new syntax in JavaScript that's going to make this a little bit easier for us. All right, see you soon. So far this morning, I've been showing you how this and new and prototypes work in JavaScript. And the whole point has just been to sort of recreate object-oriented programming the way we already know and love it based on what we've learned in Python. But as you can see, there are a lot of reasons why developers might not particularly like the syntax, if only because it's just kind of bizarre and different enough from how OOP works in every other language. We would really rather have just actual classes and instances instead of these prototypes and constructors and whatnot. So in modern JavaScript, this is in ES6, this feature was added to the language relatively recently. We have the option of using the class keyword to set up our prototypes. So this is not an entirely new feature. It's simply a cleaner and more elegant way of writing constructor functions. This is sometimes called syntactic sugar because it provides us with a new syntax that is enjoyable to use, but doesn't actually provide any new features. So now I'm going to recreate the person class using JavaScript's class keyword. So why don't I'll keep it on the same file. Or will I? No, I'm going to make a new file. Except like I was saying, both the files are still going to be in the same namespace, so that actually doesn't save me from having to rename variables. So yeah, we're just going to comment this out real quick. Okay. Yeah, so I've commented out my old implementation of the class, including the prototype methods. And I'm going to keep the instantiation though, because this part is not going to change. The class keyword only changes how I define my class. So first things first, we use the class keyword, and then I name my class, and then I have a set of curly braces which contain everything pertaining to my class. So this is a pretty nice, just a little convenience organizational feature that every part of my class is going to be grouped together. It's not going to be like with the prototype syntax where I've just got these other functions assigned to the prototype kind of outside of the constructor function. So here we're going to do everything together. So inside of the person class, I can just define functions for it. The first one is the constructor. Every class should have a constructor function. And this is going to be basically exactly the same as what I did up here. So we're just going to say this dot name equals name. Why not throw age in there too? And then also, we will give our person class a say hello method. Nathan, you got a question?
So why don't we have to put self for this type on JavaScript? Like what makes that different? Why is that unique to only Python?
Why we don't have to like put this?
Yes, like the same way.
Because JavaScript is just one step smarter and it just assumes that like you need to access it. I don't know, like this is just always accessible, I guess, is the way to think about it. Like you don't need to pass it in because you always have access to it. Either this is the window, or if we used the new keyword, then this is implicitly automatically created as an empty object, but it's automatically created for you in this scope of this function. You never have to create yourself. You don't have to name it. It's just JavaScript knows it exists there. So it is a little bit weird, I guess, because you might ask, like, where does it come from? Because you don't see the variable name defined here. But at the very least, that means that in JavaScript, the constructor function has the same number of parameters as it has arguments when we call it. Because you remember in Python, there was that mismatch of the number of arguments because we have to pass in self when we define the constructor, but not when we call it. So there would be one fewer argument when we call it than when we define it. So at least JavaScript doesn't have that kind of awkwardness going on. So since this isn't named as an argument or as a parameter, we have the same number of parameters when we define it as we have arguments when we call it. So I think that makes it a little bit more elegant. But yeah, it does work the same way as in Python, just some of these, there's some syntactic differences. Does that help?
Yes, that answered it. Thank you.
Cool. What other questions have we got? I just saw a few hands. No, no questions? I could have sworn I saw like 3 or 4 hands up at once. All right, let's continue then. Okay, so here I'm defining another method on my person class. Should look pretty familiar. So I'm not even changing any of the code that I use for instantiating Mallory. This is exactly the same. I use the new keyword, invoke the class name, pass in the arguments that the constructor uses. It's going to create a new object for me called this. It's going to return it automatically, and then it assigns it to this variable. We saw a hand up. Someone have a question?
Yeah, so when you're defining that instance variable or the method, sorry, why don't you have to put like equals function?
Like right here?
Yeah, because yeah, I was just curious, like would it refer to this as still part of the class if you don't have the function keyword there?
We don't need the function keyword because that's just the syntax for class in JavaScript. It's just understood that everything you define in here is a function.
Okay.
Nathan?
And one more thing, is there like something similar to the dunder methods for JavaScript, or is that like something that isn't present? Like, can we define something that'll like go through every string, or if there's like a string pass or something to kind of break it down?
Right, so you're asking how can we like define like how this gets turned into a string, you're saying, for example?
Just for like any dunder method, because those are really useful in Python. And is there something similar in JavaScript classes?
Kind of, sometimes. So I'm not sure if this will work, but let's just try something real quick. So what, Mallory say goodbye, it's not a function. Oh, right. Okay, so okay. So I'm gonna put some more text in here. So there is a built-in method in JavaScript called toString that exists on many like built-in types. Excuse me, that defines how to convert an item into a string. And there are some situations where JavaScript will automatically convert the type of some variable into a different type. So like I mentioned before, when you try to concatenate strings, so like if I try to do 11 plus 11, JavaScript can't add a number in a string. So it's going to convert this number into a string, and then it'll try to add them. So it concatenates two strings together. We get this 1, 1, 1, 1. And the way that it does that is because every type in JavaScript has this toString method built in. So here we can see that the number type, number class, has this built-in toString method that returns a representation of that string as a number. And this method toString gets called automatically when I try to add it to a string, because JavaScript needs to convert both types to be the same type in order to actually do the addition. So here I just manually defined a method on my person class called toString. So now if I try to concatenate this Mallory object onto any other string, it's going to first call the toString method to see what is Mallory as a string, and then it can continue. So console.log. So console log Mallory plus exclamation mark. So normally you should have no idea what this would do, because Mallory is an object. She's got a couple of properties on herself, name and age. She has a prototype with some methods. She is not a string, but because I have defined a method for her, toString, I can specify what should happen in case JavaScript needs to convert her into a string. So by doing Mallory plus and then the string exclamation mark, we get the return value from the toString method, and then that gets concatenated to that exclamation mark I was trying to concatenate to it. So this is kind of the only equivalent thing that I can think of in JavaScript. I guess because dunder string is like really the only dunder method that I use commonly in Python. So if you can think of other functionality that you want to reproduce, there's probably a way to do it in JavaScript as well. Does this answer your question?
Yes, I was just trying to see if there was a similar way to like have default kind of behaviors or something, because I think that's what the dunder string does from what I understood it to be.
Dunder string is just how to represent your objects as a string. Because normally when you try to print an object in Python, it just tells you like, oh, it's an object, what did you expect? It's not going to tell you all the properties it has on it. So the dunder string method lets you just specify clearly how to turn an object into a string, because the default behavior in Python isn't very useful. Oh yeah, so here, if I don't define a toString method for my person class, by default, when JavaScript tries to coerce an object into a string, you get this object. This is something that a lot of JavaScript developers have seen many times, and they really hate it. You try to console log something, you want to know what's going on, and it just tells you this very useless object. that, there was some kind of an object and it doesn't know how to convert it into a string. So this is what it shows you. So in this case, I was able to override that behavior with my own custom toString method. So I can specify what to do when I need to print out my object. What other questions do we have?
Can I look at your constructor setup again there?
Mhm. So many of you may be wondering, why did I spend so much time showing you all the prototypes and, this keyword and whatnot previously? I guess we still use this, but why did I spend so much time talking about prototypes when we have this class syntax now, which seems to look a lot more familiar. It seems to be a lot more similar to how OOP works in Python and other programming languages. So why did I actually bother showing you how prototypes work? And so the answer is that you've got to remember that even though we have this nice syntax that lets us, write our classes in JavaScript in a way that's more familiar and comfortable to us, this doesn't actually exist in JavaScript under the hood. When we get a bug in our program and our classes are not working the way we want them to, the thing that you're going to be debugging are not classes. The things that you will be debugging are prototypes. So, here, all the prototype code is commented out. I've just created a person class using the class keyword. But if I go to inspect it in my browser, so that does tell us it's a class. This is just showing us the exact text that I typed. But if I look at person.prototype, this should look very familiar based on the previous part of my lecture. My person class still has a prototype. It's got that same constructor function with say hello, say goodbye, and toString, and that constructor, or I'm sorry, this prototype, so it has its own prototype. Okay, so this is like the object prototype because every class is like a subtype of object. So here are just generic functions that all objects have, like has own property, toString. But in this case, there is a closer toString method on the person prototype, so it can use that one instead of going to the toString method on the object prototype. So I just want to be clear about that like for debugging purposes, you need to know, what prototypes are, how to inspect them and check that they're actually doing what you think they should be doing. You shouldn't be like totally surprised by this. Because again, when your class breaks and you're trying to debug it and see like, what is my computer, what is my program actually doing? And how is that different from what I think it should be doing? The thing that you will be debugging are the prototypes. There's no like class methods that you get to look at. One other thing, there was a question in the chat before about extending prototype methods. So like string, for example, this is the string constructor that all strings are made from. String as a prototype where all the string methods are contained, like blink. Like concat, match, replace, search. I guess I use array methods more than string methods. Yeah, to uppercase, all the good string methods are here. So if we really want to, we can add to it. Prototype do something. Cool. So now I've added a method to the string prototype. I'll make a random string. And now this string has that method that I just defined because it's on the string prototype. So every string that you create can access all the methods that are common to them. Now, that being said, this is commonly considered to be a very bad practice that you should never modify the prototypes for built-in types in JavaScript. Most people would be horrified to see you do that. So I would like to discourage you from ever doing that. The issue is that in JavaScript, all of our code runs in a shared environment. So like I was saying before, there's only one window object. And so like all the different scripts that I load, all these different scripts are going to share the same window. They share the same global scope. So it's possible that if you extend the string prototype or like the array prototype or something in one file, and then there is some other file written by a different author who is not expecting the string prototype to be manipulated, they're going to be in for some nasty surprises where potentially built-in methods that they've been using for years, they know and love, suddenly those are behaving differently. And they have no idea why, because it's nothing in their own code. Some other piece of code has modified the array prototype. And so that might be code from other collaborators on your project, or maybe there's code from like third-party developers, like marketing, analytics scripts. So there's lots of different sources for code that all has to run in the same environment. So you need to just be considerate of this fact that you're in a shared environment and not like modify things that are globally available to other parts of your code. But yeah, it's cool that you can do this, I guess. JavaScript is just a very malleable language and kind of lets you do anything. You can just rewrite everything internally. All right, so on that note, that is all I have to say today about object-oriented programming in JavaScript. I really don't want to challenge you on this too much, honestly. So for most of your exercises, we're going to continue doing OOP in Python. There's going to be some algorithmic challenges because it's much more important to me that you are proficient and fluent in OOP in Python. Because for the rest of this course, you're going to be doing a lot more OOP in Python. If you continue being a full stack JavaScript and Python developer, you'll probably still do more OOP in Python than in JavaScript. But still, OOP does come up in JavaScript to some extent, especially as we're using frameworks in the future. And these are very popular topics for interview questions. So I would feel like I was not doing my job as an instructor if I didn't, explain to you prototypes and class syntax and everything in JavaScript. Yeah, so I do want you to be familiar about this stuff, aware of it. If you, bomb questions in interviews in the future, you'll know what you can touch up on. But the focus at this point should be OOP and Python. That's a little bit more important, I would say. So on that note, this is all the content I've got for this morning. I'm sure this was kind of confusing to a lot of people. So please, let's take the rest of the time this morning for questions. What are people fuzzy on currently? Skylar?
Hey, yeah, I'm trying to think of, obviously I don't know, so that's what I'm asking, but why would we use JavaScript over Python, for instance? It seems like Python can do everything JavaScript can do.
Except run in the front end of a web browser.
Oh, all right.
We cannot run Python right here.
Oh.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'm tracking now.
Yeah. So I feel like I've said this before, but there are a lot of reasons why a lot of people don't like JavaScript. Many people consider it to be like kind of a gross programming language, and it's just really unconventional. They hate even like looking at it or thinking about it. I'm not one of those people. I've written it a lot, and so I know and love all of its quirks, but I understand the sentiment. So it's just kind of unfortunate or interesting that JavaScript is in this privileged position of being the only language that runs in the browser. I'm very confident that the industry would have like completely forgotten about JavaScript and just moved past it, decades ago, if there was any other option. If we had the option to just run Python code in the browser, I'm sure a lot of people would be doing that. A lot of people would probably be writing like PHP in the front end, or maybe Go in the front end. But I think there would be very few people, in 2022 who would choose to build their front end with JavaScript if they could choose any other programming language as well. It's just that this is the only option we have. So you better learn to love it. Or be a backend developer. That's also an option. But even then, you should have some appreciation of JavaScript. So the people you're interacting with, how like the other half of the application works, how your code affects their work, things like that. What other questions have we got?
When you're working with JavaScript on the front end doing stuff like this, are you using like very heavily the class method that you just showed us? Is that pretty like heavily used in JavaScript, or does it not matter as much as Python with the classes and object-oriented stuff?
Today in 2022, I would say it's very conventional to use this class syntax. Even though I said it's important that you understand this prototype syntax, nobody likes looking at it. So to the extent that people are going to be defining classes in JavaScript, nowadays it is basically always using this class syntax. Sound good?
Yes.
I'm starting to feel like JavaScript's the language to be the primary one, like to be really, really good at, because it's almost like you can do everything Python can do in JavaScript and the website stuff too.
Yeah, I mean, that's been my strategy for most of my career. I just got really good at JavaScript early on in my career. So great at front end, great at building Node.js backends. I was able to build an Electron app desktop application using JavaScript, built like a web VR application using JavaScript. There was a time when you could build Unity games using JavaScript. I built like an Alexa application once also using JavaScript. You can just do too many things with JavaScript. You can just insert it into places where it really doesn't belong. But definitely, like if you're going to learn one programming language and you want to open up as many doors for you as possible, that would be JavaScript. Oh, also mobile applications, if I didn't mention that. I built a mobile application in the Google Play Store using JavaScript. So yeah, you can definitely do a lot with it. I mean, that being said, Python can do some things that JavaScript does not do. The Python community is very big on like data science and other types of science as well, I guess. So if you need to do like math and science, there's a very good chance that like someone has already written a library in Python that solves hard problems for you. Like, AI, machine learning, there's all kinds of libraries in Python for doing that kind of stuff. Not so much in other programming languages. So nowadays, pretty much all of the machine learning and AI community, all those engineers, they're basically all working in Python just because that's where the community is. So yeah, if I had to do some advanced statistics, for example, I would prefer to do that in Python over JavaScript, just because the JavaScript community isn't really big in math and science the way the Python community is.
When you're going up for jobs, how do they look at it as, because I know some companies use like C++ or Java or something. Do they care if you know a specific language? Like, let's say you didn't know Python and you only knew JavaScript.
It depends where you where you're applying, there are, some places that really just don't have the time or ability to train people. And so they're really hoping that you can hit the ground running, in your first couple of weeks or whatever, which means that you should already be familiar with all the languages and tools that they use there, or at least most of the tools and all the languages that they use there. But in a lot of companies that I think are a little bit more reasonable, they'll give you, a lot more time to get up to speed. I think, we've heard like a month is a reasonable amount of time to become fully productive after joining a company as a junior developer. And they'll often have the expectation that you don't know all of their languages and tools specifically, but that you understand enough about programming in general that you can figure out what you need to learn. So they might say that they want you to know at least one dynamic programming language, some dynamically typed programming language, such as Ruby, Python, or JavaScript. And then some places might say like they want you to know like a statically typed programming language, such as Java, C++, or C#. So it's not like they want you to know this one specific language, but do you know this language or one that's like kind of similar to it? So for lots of dev shops, I'd say they consider Python and JavaScript to be similar enough that if you know one of them, they're confident that you can learn the other on the job. Kind of the same thing for like web frameworks. There are a lot of front-end frameworks out there. We're going to learn React in this course. There's also Vue and Angular, which I've used in the past. Svelte is kind of new and trendy, people talking about it a little bit, but they all do roughly the same thing. They all solve the same problem. It's just, how can I use JavaScript to make the front end of a web application? And so a lot of employers, they don't necessarily expect that you have experience with their particular framework that they use. It's more just that they want to see that you understand like what a front-end framework is and what problems it solves. And if you've used any front-end framework, you can probably learn the one that they're using without too much trouble. So it also depends kind of on how popular the framework is. So for example, React is a very popular framework. It is in the United States, it's the most popular front-end framework. That's not true in other countries because the United States is just really big on Facebook for some reason. So we think React is cool and it's popular here. But in the United States, React is the most popular front-end framework. And so it's really easy for an employer to insist on React experience for applicants because there are just so many people that already have React experience. Whereas if your company is using like Vue as your front-end framework, they would love it if you have experience with Vue, but they also might say like, there aren't really that many Vue developers around here, but React is pretty similar. So if you have experience with React, we're going to say that's good enough. And we're going to trust that you can learn Vue on the job since you already know React. So yeah, I'd say the concepts are most important. It's important that you learn at least one like language in a category of languages. So then you can persuade people that you can learn similar ones. You should learn one tool in each like category of tools. So like front-end framework, back-end framework, database, ORM, we're going to learn about those later. If you learn at least one of these things, of each type of things, then employers will trust that you can learn another tool that solves the same problem. Does that answer your question?
Yep, that answers. Thank you.
Cool. I feel like that might have been a bit more than you're asking for, kind of a long-winded response, but I
No,
hope it
that
was
was
useful.
perfect.
All right, cool. Do we have any other questions about OOP or JavaScript or just the web?
Yeah, I got a question.
Systems? Yep.
So in using the class keyword in JavaScript, after the constructor, you have your methods. Those are pretty much what I'm assuming is happening is under the hood, like the say hello method and the say goodbye method is just using the prototype method way that you showed us earlier, right?
Yep.
That's
right.
That's what JavaScript is doing for us. So
Yeah, if
when
I
you
go
say
to my
that,
browser, we can see it right here.
okay. Right, and so when you say that when we're debugging, we're going to have to be debugging the prototype method. So how would that work? Like, can you give an example of like if you have to debug it, but you're using the class keyword, how would you go about debugging it normally? Or would you have to break it out into the prototype to figure out like what's going on?
I mean, I guess at a basic level, what I'm saying is like, if I create a person and I try to call Mallory.say hello, and maybe I get an error message that's like, say hello is not a function. I'm like, well, I thought it was a function. Why can't I call this thing that I think exists? And like, I'm reading the class definition and it looks correct to me. And I'm just like, why is this not working? I could, just ask my program what it thinks my class is doing instead of just reading the code. And so then I would go to my browser and basically just have to know that the methods are defined on the prototype. So I would look at person.prototype and I might notice like, oh, hey, like say hello isn't actually on the prototype. Maybe I didn't save the file, or there's a typo in the name. Like, maybe I'm not using the right version of the file, or like it was cached or something.
Okay, so basically we just need to understand how it's working.
Yeah.
To be able to do that. Okay, got it.
The methods are on the prototype. That's, I guess, the primary thing that you need to understand. All right, what other questions we got? Oh, I used to use R. That was fun. I did a lot of statistics back in college. R is a statistical package. Yeah, JavaScript does everything.
Would you say that R is falling behind Python, or is it still relevant?
I've really been too out of touch with that community to answer that question confidently, but I'm inclined to say that it's kind of falling out of favor. I think that more and more recently, like I feel like a long time ago, a lot of scientists didn't want to learn programming because it was like, ooh, scary software engineering. And so they just learned these like dedicated, like purpose-built programs just for statistics. So I think SAS is another one, which don't get confused with, there's a CSS framework called SAS, but there's like a statistics program also called SAS. And I guess like over time, these statistics programs just got so complicated that enough people decided like for all the complexity in this program, I could just learn like a real programming language. And so I think more commonly, that's what people are doing. They're just learning Python and then learning some statistical library in Python. And then that has a bunch of advantages because it's easier to like, define functions that help you abstract out the complexity. You can define loops and things for doing something repeatedly. It's using like a more like familiar syntax, I guess. Like it's easier to learn Python because there's just a million tutorials online compared with learning R. Yeah, probably other reasons too that I'm not thinking of, but just having a full programming language is very flexible and very powerful compared with, I'm not sure what all R can do compared with, statistical packages in Python. Hope that helps. But yeah, I'm not really an expert on that anymore.
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
So let's see, apparently Python can run in the browser with PyScript. So I've definitely heard about stuff like this, like lots of initiatives to get different programming languages working in the front end. I know there's like Blazor, which is a framework for C# to run the front end, but people have been talking about that for like a decade and it's still not ready for prime time. So this sounds cool, but I've got to imagine that there's some reason why people aren't using it. So maybe it just doesn't have really good marketing and it's like great and everyone should be using it. Or maybe there's some reason why it's not actually ready for prime time. There might be some slight bugs in it or some missing features that make it just not quite like a full replacement for JavaScript in the browser. But this is interesting. Might be something to keep your eye on.
Doesn't it just transpile to JavaScript anyway?
I assume so.
Yeah, I think the issue is
April 30th.
JavaScript just kind of gained that legacy traction.
That is a
Every
big part of
single
that.
browser uses it.
Yeah, like there's a lot of
And,
libraries and frameworks written in JavaScript already, but there's no like React framework written in Python, for example. So you would have to like rewrite all of your tools, which nobody's got time for that.
Apparently PyScript was just released like a month ago.
Oh. So yeah, I might need to wait a little bit before it's actually good to go for professional purposes. But it is cool though. Definitely something to keep your eye on. I'm going to star that. Might come back here. All right. Any other questions this morning about OOP, JavaScript, the web, anything we've been talking about?
I have a question about Flutter. I don't know if that's relevant, but I hear about Flutter a lot and how like I guess relevant is it?
That's a good question. So I don't know a ton about Flutter. I just know it's a framework for building mobile applications. Okay, here we go. So it's another one of those same stories where like, instead of building an iPhone application and an Android application, you want to just build one application that deploys to multiple OSs. So Flutter is a framework that lets you use the Dart programming language to build mobile applications. Which I have never worked with before. I guess this is Dart. This is a language you can use for building mobile applications with Flutter. Kind of looks similar to JavaScript, but I really don't know. I've never used it before. So this is a newer framework. I want to say that this was released since the last time I was actually doing any mobile application development, which is a little bit sad because all the tools that I used have been sunset, so I can't actually use them anymore. And there's like a whole bunch of new tools. So I might have to learn Flutter, but then I would also have to learn Dart, and I would probably rather continue using JavaScript. I'm sorry, what was your original question?
I guess I just been hearing a lot about Flutter and how it's good because like you can make like, mobile apps and web apps all in one thing, and it like figures out how to like size everything. So I was wondering like how relevant that would be to learn like as like for the market, like if you think this would get more popular and more like sought out.
It's certainly relevant, but what might be easier for you is going to be React Native. So, I just Googled it real quick for mobile app frameworks because there's new ones all the time. I don't keep up to date on this. I'm not primarily a mobile developer. So it seems like right now the big dog in the room is still React Native. It's been kind of buggy for a long time, but I hear it's gotten much better in recent years. So it seems now it's better than all the other competition. You're basically going to use the same skills you learned for React for building web applications, but you can apply that to building mobile applications instead. So if you want to, dip your toes into mobile app development, React Native is probably a good thing to learn because it, flexes your JavaScript skills that you already have that we're going to develop in this bootcamp, and lets you, build applications for iOS and Android. But you still get to learn a lot of concepts that are specific to mobile app development, just not the programming languages themselves. And I have definitely seen jobs that advertise for specifically React Native. And I've actually hired once specifically for a React Native developer. So this beyond just React, React Native is a skill that is in demand. I've also seen Flutter being requested in job applications, but you'd have to learn a new programming language for it. So you have to ask yourself how dedicated you are to mobile application development. Xamarin is something I haven't heard of in a long time. You can use C# for making applications on a variety of platforms. And then Ionic used to be popular. I think this is from the Angular people. Yeah, so this is specifically for Angular JS. You can use Angular to make mobile applications. So Ionic is basically just like React Native, except for Angular developers. Just letting you use your front-end skills to make a mobile application. Apache Cordova is the service that I used to be using, actually. And what is it? I think Adobe owns this right now, and they actually shut down this like online build tool that I was using in order to build my application. So I would discourage anyone from using Cordova or PhoneGap. I think of these as being like a little bit more outdated and not very well supported anymore. And I haven't heard of anyone using jQuery mobile in like a decade. So yeah, if you want to build a mobile application, I would first try out, where we go, React Native. And then if you're really serious about it, maybe Flutter is cool. But I mean, if you're really serious about mobile app development, you should probably just learn Objective-C and Java so that you can develop native applications. And I think that's really how you make the big bucks as a mobile developer. I just saw a hand up.
Yes. Have you heard of people saying vanilla before, like a programming language, like vanilla JavaScript?
Yeah, that just means without a framework.
Without a framework. Okay, and so all of these like React and Angular and Flutter, those are all frameworks. They're not like programming languages.
Correct. So React is just a whole bunch of JavaScript code that someone else has written. Just a bunch of like functions and classes that we can use in our own code to help us skip a few steps.
Okay, so all these frameworks, are they like open source then? Like they don't get like Facebook, I think you said, created React, and then a bunch of other companies probably use React. Do they have to like pay for that?
No, they do not pay for it. All of the libraries and frameworks that we'll be using in this course are open source.
Okay.
Yeah. So that actually works out really well for Facebook, making it open source, because if it was closed source, like nobody else would use it. People wouldn't want to pay for it, especially if you have to get like licenses per developer, and then you have to like relicense it as you expand your team or as you lay people off or whatever. There would just be a lot of logistical headaches. People at that point would probably just rather make their own framework. So the fact that it's free makes it more popular, and being popular is really important for a framework. It means that if you're having problems, you can ask about it on Stack Overflow, and it's very likely that someone else has had the same problem and there's already been an answer to it. If you're using an unpopular framework, you're probably going to be just debugging things on your own for hours and pulling your hair out, and it's terrible. And something else I was going to say about that. I forgot. Can you remind me, what was your original question?
I was just kind of figuring out like the difference between like a programming language, like a vanilla programming language versus a framework.
Okay, yeah.
But I feel like you answered it pretty thoroughly. And then it's just kind of weird that like people would spend hours or like years probably making a free application like that everybody can use. I don't know. It's just interesting.
Oh yeah, so that's right. I was going to expand on that. So being popular is great. Just because there's a more robust community. Other people are going to make like add-ons and extensions for React, which makes it even more useful. So Facebook doesn't have to develop all those add-ons and extensions and plugins for React. The community builds them just because they love React so much and depend on it for their work. But Facebook still gets to benefit from that. But then probably the most important part is that when it's open source, developers all over the world who depend on React will fix bugs for it. So even if like React itself is just a super buggy library, like Facebook themselves don't need to fix that. They can just release into the world and be like, hey, check out this great thing we made. And people can raise issues on GitHub and be like, hey, you know, React doesn't work. This thing's broken and that thing's broken. And then yet other developers who also don't work for Facebook can submit pull requests to fix those bugs. So Facebook is really getting like a lot of free labor in developing React by making it open source. Whereas if they made people pay for it to begin with, like who knows if it would even be good enough that anyone would want to pay for it.
Can a framework become closed? Like, can Facebook just one day be like, all right, we have all the extensions we need from you for free. Now you have to pay for it.
I mean, like they could do that going forward, I think.
So I heard that was like a fear that like at one time, I think Facebook or something was about to become closed, some framework. So a lot of developers were like freaking out.
I mean, I think in that situation, what would happen is whatever was the last version of Facebook to be released open source, or I'm sorry, whatever was the last version of React to be released open source, people would just fork that version and then create their own new community-led open source fork of React. Because generally the software industry does not like to depend on proprietary closed source software if it can avoid it.
Yeah. Are there any companies that you know of that use closed frameworks? And that just, does that just mean they kind of just make their own, like make their projects unique, like structured different ways, different abilities and stuff like that?
Yeah, like I wouldn't even say it's a closed source framework. It's like, but a lot of companies just don't even release their framework because it only makes sense in their company for their application.
Okay, that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. But I would definitely discourage you from working at any company like that. If they tell you that they have their own like homegrown bespoke framework, you should just run. It's probably going to be like a miserable experience working there because you're fully dependent on their documentation for how the framework works and like talking to the other engineers there for how the framework works. Whereas in contrast, using React, like you can just go to the documentation online to see how React works. You're not dependent on your workplace documenting all that for you. Similarly, there's not going to be any answers on Stack Overflow for how to solve common problems if you're using a homegrown framework. You have to hope that that's documented or that your coworkers have answers to your problems. And then the worst part of all is that it doesn't really build your resume up very much. Like if you are trying to apply to another job and you say like, yeah, we use this homegrown framework and they're using React, it's not really clear to that employer if your experience with the homegrown framework is going to actually translate over and prepare you to be a React developer. Whereas if you've used, you know, like any modern front-end framework, you'll have a really easy time getting jobs in the future using that exact framework. And you'll have a relatively easy time getting jobs in the future using similar frameworks as well. Just, it's another, you know, buzzword you get to put on your resume. And especially for a lot of recruiters, the only thing they understand are the buzzwords, these like acronyms for frameworks and stuff like that. So yeah, I would definitely encourage you to find a company to work at that's using some kind of modern framework. All right, so we're going a few minutes over now. So unless people have any more questions, I think this is a good time to conclude today's lecture. Last chance for questions. Anybody? Going once, going twice? No. Okay. Awesome.